In this video, I will show you 5 basic watercolor techniques. This palette of watercolors comes with 8 different colors and its own paintbrush. Of course, you will need a container full of water and also a paper towel. I like to call this first technique the flat wash. The name comes from the very flat and solid color we're about to create. Watercolor pigment is semi-moist, so that's why it looks kind of shiny in the palette. It's slightly sticky, so what we have to do is we have to add more water into it, and I like to call that charging the color. So you're basically activating it in order to paint with that color. So we're charging it up, adding little bits of water at a time to get it ready so we can paint with it. Once the paint is ready, you can start to load up your paintbrush, getting all that juicy pigment, and then very slowly start to paint brush strokes, one kind of overlapping the other in a solid band. Always move slowly and gently with watercolors. If you move too fast or if you rub too much in the same place, remember your paper has a limit. So if you keep rubbing back and forth, it's going to start to tear that paper. It has a threshold to it. Different types of paper work better with watercolors. So thinner paper may not work as well as thicker, more heavyweight paper. There's actually watercolor paper that has more of a texture, or what we call a tooth. So it's able to absorb more water and more pigment. But our paper, be gentle with it. So we're just trying to create the most solid color we can with the flat wash. Always, before you switch colors, don't forget to clean out your paintbrush. Nobody likes a really messy watercolor palette. That's just gross. So clean it out nice and thoroughly, maybe even dry it off with a paper towel. But keep our palettes nice and clean. Technique number 2 is called the Grated Wash. So we're going to create a gradient of color from dark to light. Remember to activate your colors first by charging water into it. Next, you're going to thoroughly load up that paintbrush, and you'll start to paint a band. My shape is a little funky, but I'm going to paint a dark section at the top. And then towards the bottom of that section, I'll start to pull that pigment. So to do that, I'm going to dip my paintbrush into the water, and then I will paint about 2 to 3 brush strokes back and forth. So you'll continue to add more water with 2 to 3 brush strokes, always slightly overlapping your previous. So you'll keep working your way down your gradient, and it will gradually dilute the pigment more and more until eventually you'll get a very, very light value towards the bottom. The third technique I'm going to show you is called wet on wet. Make sure you have a nice clean brush, And the first thing you're going to do is actually just paint clean water onto your paper. This is a good reminder to always check the cleanliness of your water. Mine is still okay, it's slightly purple, but as you're cleaning your brush and switching colors, make sure that you don't have the black swamp in your container. It's important to have clean water to avoid any muddiness. So once you've added a nice layer of water over your paper, you're going to charge a new color if you want to switch, and then you'll just add little spots of color to see how it puddles out. So what I like to mention when you're painting with watercolors is kind of a funny trick. So the water is always going to tell the paint where to flow. It's never going to flow into dry areas of your paper. So if you have a puddle on your paper and you add color into that, it's only going to stay where the water is. If you remember that while you're painting with watercolors, you can create just about anything and you have entire control over where to direct the paint. A lot of times, watercolors can get away from us and get out of control. But once you know that the water tells the paint where to go, you can be the ultimate master of watercolors. So try mixing a couple of different colors to see how they swirl and interact with one another. This fourth technique I like to call the Liftoff. So you will need a paper towel for this technique. I'm going to start by applying the wet on wet technique again, just so you can see the magic of the swirling watercolors one more time. But I'm going to do the Liftoff technique after that. To achieve the best results for this technique, it helps if you have a lot of color and a lot of pigment already on your paper. And your paper also still has to be wet for it to work. So this is a good technique to make clouds. You're going to kind of ball up your paper towel randomly, and you're going to press it into that color and into that pigment. And when you lift it up, you should have a lighter area that's kind of shaped like your paper towel. So try different shapes and scrunch up the paper towels in different ways to get different shapes. This final technique is going to be called the dry brush. So I'm going to charge my orange color because I haven't used it yet. And this technique happens naturally while you're painting and while your brush is starting to dry out. But there's another way that you can kind of achieve this right off the bat without painting all over the place. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of drying out my brush and I'm pressing into the bristles. You can see how I've pressed the bristles to fan them out a little bit. Notice when you dip right into that fresh charged color, it'll press your bristles back together. So you want to try to separate the bristles and then only dip the very ends, the very tips into that color. So it's just on those individual strands. And then when you carry it across your paper, you should have these streaky marks from those individual bristles of the brush. So I'm pressing those bristles very gently to separate them with my thumb. You can also try a blotting technique with the dry brush by just tapping the ends onto the paper. This is a good way to add texture into your work. So these are the 5 basic watercolor techniques: the flat wash, grated wash, wet on wet, lift off, and the dry brush. This was a Hammer Time production. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.